So back to some of the PMBOK process groups. We've covered the first two, initiating and planning. Now we're going to talk about executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing, which are, the meat of the project are the executing and the monitoring and controlling process groups. In the project lifecycle of executing, I'll just read it from PMBOK because this one is important. The executing process group consists of those processes performed to complete the work defined in the project management plan to satisfy the project specifications. So this is where you're doing your work. Marnell just kind of mentioned requirements are the key. Every project that I've been on that's been successful has always started out with good requirements. Because if you don't have good requirements, you don't smoothly go along as you're building the project and the product. So the key inputs to the executing phase are the project management plans and approved change requests. So you did all these project management plans, you did your cost management plan, you did your time management plan, you did your scope management plan in your planning phase. Well, here you want to put those plans in place. You don't want to make them in the planning and then they become shelfware because this is telling you how you're going to execute the project. And a key component of that is the approved change requests. There should be nothing different from the design in this phase unless there's an approved change request that changed the specific requirement to get you there. And these have to go through your change control process, your integrated change control process, which the PMBOK calls it integration management, which is one of the first chapters that brings all the knowledge areas together. Here, the key thing, too, is the project schedule. You're going to set up your project schedule, and you're going to baseline that schedule. And you're going to measure yourself against that schedule, and you're going to use that schedule in your monitoring and control phase that we'll talk about next. But the monitoring and control phase and executing phase kind of go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other, so they're two different process groups and have different processes in them, but they really are going hand in hand. Here the key inputs again is the budget. You don't want any changes in your budget unless there's an approved change request. Your requirements traceability matrix. You want to trace your requirements back to whether it's your design documents, your use cases, whatever document you're going to, and what phase you're in of the life cycle. So if you're in testing, you want your test cases to go back to a requirements traceability matrix. The key considerations in this is deliverable review and acceptance. As the project, you're going to bring in the vendor's going to hand you these deliverables, and you're going to want to make sure that they're acceptable. Meaning, do they trace back to the requirements? Is there any gold plating in them where they've given you something that you didn't necessarily ask for? So you want to, and you're going to have a deliverable review and acceptance process on your project so that you know when a deliverable is acceptable. And one of the key considerations here is communication. Communication is vital throughout the entire project. And on projects that are, sometimes there's a lot of closed doors, that's not a good thing. Because communication needs to be open and out to everybody. And you need to keep everyone in line with what's going on with the project and how we're doing against our timeline and how we're doing against everything it is, so that everyone on the project knows what's going on. Some of the key outputs here are the verified and accepted deliverables, because that's where you're going to measure yourself against when you come down to saying if the project's complete. And the performance data. So that's going to be, your performance data there is, what most of us will think about would be time management, right? You have your baseline schedule. How are we doing against our schedule? Are we falling behind? Are we ahead? I've never been ahead on a schedule, but there's always a possibility. And being behind on the schedule isn't bad if you can explain why those things are happening. It could be because you have approved change requests, so you've changed some stuff. Change isn't necessarily bad, it just needs to be planned for and going forward. So you can have your project schedule baseline and you can be going against that, and you just want to make sure that you're proceeding as necessary. So the next project process group is the monitoring and controlling. But like I said, this kind of goes hand in hand with the executing of the project. Because it's not, these process groups aren't sequential per se, because you're going to do the processes over and over until they fit what you need on the project. So again, the key inputs are the project management plans, the project deliverables, and the performance data. So this is where you're going to come out, and what comes out of the monitoring and controlling is your status reports. Your status reports are going to consist of how you're doing against your schedule, how you're doing against your budget, how you're doing against your costs. So all the things that are important to be measured are coming out in the monitoring and controlling, and they're being communicated throughout the project, not just sitting in the project director or the project manager's head or his or her office. The key outputs from this, change logs and approved change requests. So you want to always keep track of the changes that are happening on your project, have them documented, have them go through an approval process. You don't want just one person deciding that this change is okay. You want it to go through your change control board. And your quality control measurements here. Quality management is a PMBOK knowledge area, and then you'll put in you'll have your quality assurance and your quality control requirements that will be spelled out in your quality assurance matrix or your management plan, and you want to make sure that you're meeting those measurements for the project. And again, the key consideration here is transparency and open communication. The more open communication you have and let everyone on the project know what's going on, the better off your project will be. So a couple of things to keep important to think about on this one is, do you have the right data to know where you are in the project and where the true risks and issues are? So are you measuring, you chose to measure some stuff, are you measuring the right things? Is that going to go where you want it to go? And two, do you have an effective governance process in place to make timely decisions? And the key word there is timely. So your governance process needs to be put in place so that you can make decisions, but it can't be so convoluted that you have to go all the way up to the executive steering committee for some kind of minor changes that are within your budgetary constraints on your project. If it's huge, yes, you need to take that all the way up to the executive steering committee, but you want to make sure your governance is, to lack of a better term, agile enough so that you can move forward and not get bogged down in the details of the project. And finally, the last process group that's important from the PMBOK perspective is the closing process. Remember that a project is a time-boxed endeavor that comes out with a project. So great, we initiated the project, we planned the project, we monitored and controlled it, and we executed it. So finally we get to close the project. So you're going to, your key inputs here are all your accepted deliverables, all your project management plans, and you're going to have a decision on how those will be archived. How will you document lessons learned so that you can take those lessons learned and take it to your next project. So it's not just a one-time thing where you don't have to reinvent the wheel the next time you do a project. And then you'll close out the contract if applicable as well. Say goodbye to your vendor and you move on, and everything goes on once the project is closed.
Yay, my favorite part.
So now we've gone through and very quickly and at a high level the 5 different process groups of PMBOK and how they relate to the software development lifecycle. So now we're going to talk, Tina's going to come up and talk a little bit more about the system development lifecycle and whether or not you use a waterfall, agile, and different processes that you can use.
Thank you, David. Even as I was sitting there and listening to these great speakers talk about some important concepts to us today, I went back to a time when systems were so simple that a change to a system meant a programmer writing a piece of code or a small team working to automate a procedure. But nowadays, systems have grown to be so complex and big that changes involve a large group of analysts, programmers, architects, testers, users working together in order to make even the slightest change to a system. That being said, for all of these entities to be able to work together to accomplish such complex goals, we need a process. And that's what the SDLC, which is the System Development Life Cycle, comes into picture. So we're going to talk a little more about this today. David did talk to us about the phases here. I'm going to go into this a little more in detail. Once we make a determination of whether we want to build a completely new system or we want to make changes to an existing system, the first phase of the SDLC comes into picture. We've talked about this over and over again today, so that brings up how critical requirements are for the entire life cycle of the system development. Requirements itself is derived from the term of identifying what the end product should be, what the end users want for the system to perform in the end. And there are several techniques to gather requirements and elicit them. Some of them are having JAD sessions, conducting meetings, questionnaires, storyboarding, if you will, as well. Once these requirements are gathered and documented, that forms the basis for all of the other phases that you see up here. That provides a guideline for what the end product should actually be. And so it's really critical through the entire SDLC phase. The system design phase itself is nothing but capturing the functions and operations of what we expect for the system to perform. It can include screenshots, prototypes, pseudocodes, business rules, as well as prototypes, initial prototypes of what you want your end system to look like. In capturing that, we also list out the components, the operations, the modules that we require in order to build that particular system. Development and unit testing. It is here that the actual code is written. Sometimes it's simple, sometimes complex, so it becomes really critical to test the code that has been written, to identify bugs early on, and to be able to resolve them in a fashion that it does not impact production in the end. So another key feature here is to ensure that all of the pieces of the code are working together, which we term as interoperability. And that's one of the key features identified with this phase. Finally, testing, which includes system testing, integration testing, and user acceptance testing. While I'm sure you are all aware of system and integration testing, I want to talk a little more about user acceptance testing, because this is a very critical feature. It is here that the clients, stakeholders, and the end users itself are allowed to test the system. It's here that they check to ensure that their expectations from the system have been met, and the system is able to perform in real-time scenarios, as they had portrayed first when they came up with their requirements in our very first phase of requirements, gathering and elicitation. Once that's been completed, we finally get to the implementation phase. The completed system is finally deployed and runs actual business. So these are the basic phases of the system development lifecycle. That being said, there are several methodologies that have been identified over the years. The two most prominent that have evolved and been accepted widely by the industry are the Waterfall and Agile methodology. How many of you sitting here today, through your experiences with projects, have used either the Agile or the Waterfall methodology? Great. How many of you have used both Agile and Waterfall methodologies? Excellent. So for those of you that have used one or the other, this would be a good exercise for you to compare your experiences with the methodology that you haven't used, and perhaps make an analysis of being able to determine if you can choose one over the other for the product or the system that you're intending to build. The waterfall model itself follows a sequential or a non-iterative approach. As you can see, it flows from one phase to the other, taking the project from conception through requirements, design, development, testing, and implementation. These flow in a more sequential fashion, and you do not go back and backtrack these processes. Agile, on the other hand, is a more iterative approach. The requirements known at the time are taken into consideration, and the project is started off. Developers start with a very simplistic project design. The large work module is split into smaller bits and smaller work modules that are divided into specific time frames known as sprints, which can be either on a weekly or a monthly basis. The benefit of this process is that at the end of each sprint, the priorities of these requirements are re-evaluated. Customer feedback is considered, and each of the completed module is tested to ensure that bugs are identified early on. So that's where the Agile methodology has evolved and turns out to be more flexible compared to the Waterfall methodology. Some of the advantages, with each methodology we do have advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons if you will. Some of the ones that we'd like to highlight today with the Waterfall and Agile is that Agile itself is more flexible in terms of the fact that requirements can be reevaluated Once requirements are locked down at the start, the customer or the business has the ability to go back and change these requirements, because of which each sprint plays a key role. At the start of a sprint, you get to prioritize and come up with a backlog of items that you want to incorporate in the sprints to follow. You have the ability to add requirements to the sprint. If bugs or defects are identified, you can fix them then and there, and it's easier to work with when compared to Waterfall, which has a more rigid approach. The benefits of the Waterfall, however, are fixing the requirements early on gives you a clear picture of what the end product should look like. So the business knows what you're setting your expectations for and what you want to see as a final product. Whereas in the Agile, you have an initial idea of what you want the system to be, and many a time the end product is a lot different from what you perceive for it to be. So in such a scenario, how then do you choose which model works best for you? The key factor comes down to the context of your project. If you're building a system or a product that is based on the rapidly changing industry today, Agile is probably the way for you to go. If you have rigid requirements that you have a clear understanding for, and you know that it's something that can be set and you know what to expect from your system, Waterfall then is the best methodology. Or better yet, in several scenarios, picking up the processes from both these methodologies and combining them to work for your project would be the best way to go as well.